So Janet is actually one of the recent additions to the process study model improvement panel here, but today she'll be speaking as PI of the Southwest Pacific Ocean Circulation and Climate Experiment, or SPICE. Most of us know Janet as an observational oceanographer. Currently at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Janet received her PhD in physical oceanography from the University of Sydney. Has since conducted observational work probably in most corners of the global ocean. So thanks very much, Janet, for talking with us today, and please take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. So I am going to tell you a little bit about the Southwest Pacific Ocean Circulation and Climate Experiment today, known as SPICE, but I'm reporting on behalf of so many PIs that I can't even list them all here because it's a really, truly an international study. I'm going to focus, because we are US CLIVAR, I'm going to focus primarily on the USA collaborative efforts, and you'll find that I'm really going to focus in on the Solomon Sea part of SPICE later on in the project, because that's what I've mainly been involved with. But SPICE is really indebted to Alex Ganachar, who is at Lagos IRD in Toulouse, France. He has been so instrumental in herding all us cats and getting us all together and initiating SPICE, initiating the whole effort. It was while he was at IRD in Nouméa. And co-PIs from Toulouse, from France, include Sophie Cravatte, Gerard Eldin, Lionel Gordeau, and Natasha Diath and Angelique Millet. And then we have a multi-institutional group from University of Papua New Guinea and JAMSTEC in Japan, as well as numerous students from all those institutes. And then also PIs from Australia, New Zealand, Nouméa, Fiji, all over the Southwest Pacific. So it really, truly is an international group. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so the key motivation with SPICE was to look at the oceanic connection from the subtropics to the equator. Over 70% of the waters found in the equatorial undercurrent in the equator comes from the southern hemisphere. And to get there, it comes from the middle of the subtropics and then has to wind its way through the major seas of the boundary such as the Tasman Sea, the Coral Sea, and the Solomon Sea. Hang on, there we go. Okay. And it's a major as I will show you, it's a really, it's a remote region. There's a lot of temporal variability. And in this region, in the Southwest Pacific, there's these really strong, narrow currents, and they have to go through all this convoluted island and complex bathymetry. And so it's really posing serious challenges to both observations and numerical modeling. So then our overarching goal of SPICE was to observe, model, and understand the role of the Southwest Pacific circulation in the large-scale, low-climate frequency of modulation of climate signatures. So do these changes in regional transport of mass and heat in the ocean matter to climate? So some of the complementary challenges to that are to understand the circulation boundary currents and jets, the different water masses that are found in the Southwest Pacific. We want to understand how those water masses are transformed during their transit during in the Southwest Pacific, and also understand the circulation variability in conjunction with the South Pacific Convergence Zone, which is found, it's the Southern Hemisphere counterpart to the ITCZ. We want to know the key, and ultimately our goal is to understand the key observation metrics where their monitoring is going to be important to climate prediction. So let's have a look at the implementation of SPICE. This is a timeline. A brief timeline. In 2005, we had our first SPICE workshop, and it was up in Malanda in Australia. Malanda is this beautiful little town set up in the forest, in the rainforest in northern Queensland. So it was an idyllic spot for us for about 40 people to get together and decide what sort of issues we might address with SPICE. that led then to a development of a science document, as well as an implementation plan in 2008 that Alex Gunnershard led again, and that led to endorsement by International CLIVAR in 2008. And since then, we've been heavily involved in the field work and the numerical modelling, as well as providing numerous presentations on progress. And specifically, I want to call out this 2013 article in CLIVAR Exchanges called Advances from SPICE. And more recently, last year, we put together a special JGR issue in conjunction with colleagues from NPOS, which is the North Pacific Ocean Circulation Experiment. And their focus is more on North Pacific boundary currents. And both of these issues were led by Alex. So we have 19 institutes involved in SPICE and 7 countries. So this is another way of looking at the timetable. And I guess what this really shows is how we are synchronously looking at model development, numerical modelling, as well as observations. So they're happening at the same time. I'll call out a couple of the details of these components later on, but I want you to see that it's not like the numerical modelling necessarily follows after the observations. We're using both of these components to help instruct where observations might be needed, as well as what observations might be needed for to improve numerical models, as well as including monitoring system designs, and specifically that has involved glider surveys, as I'll show in a bit. And so this really says the same sort of thing. We have a multi-pronged simultaneous approach which involves both in situ observations as well as high-resolution modelling to try and understand this really complex western boundary current system. So let's start off with the modelling. We have a number of modelling efforts of both global and regional models, including, for instance, Blue Link from Australia and the Mercator Ocean from France. And so we really need to have these at any resolving spatial scales, much less than 10 kilometres, particularly in these regional seas. So we're looking here at a 3-kilometre nested model that Natasha Diab has developed and written about in a couple of papers. And that's needed because we have such active mesoscale activity. There's also these multi-decadal climate trends, and we need to be able to link how global climate phenomena like ENSO or the Southern Annular Mode or the PDO phenomena, how they impact coastal regions, because it's these coastal regions that are really important, because that's where 90% of the population lives in Australia, for instance, and also how it impacts all these really small island nations like Fiji and New Caledonia and Vanuatu. So our specific studies include the numerical studies is understanding these jet-like structures in the western boundary current. So what you can see is we have the South Equatorial Current coming in, which is the northern limb of the subtropical cell, subtropical gyre, and it comes in and it hits all these islands and it just bifurcates and breaks up into many different jets. There's the North Vanuatu jet, the New Caledonia jet, the Southern Caledonia jet, and then once it hits the coast of Australia, it forms the East Australian Current. That's the poleward going western boundary current of the Southern Pacific, and then that extends either as the East Australian Current extension or heads back eastward as the Tasman Front to form the lower limb of that subtropical cell. Also here, the SEC also forms an equatorward limb of western boundary current to become the lower western boundary current, lower latitude western boundary current of the New Guinea coastal current, and that system impacts the Solomon Sea, as I'll show later. So there's been a lot of effort recently to understand the jet-like structures in this region. understanding the eddy dynamics in these boundary currents of the East Australian current plus the Gulf of Papua current and the New Guinea coastal undercurrent. There's been efforts to understand the shelf scale upwelling processes and as well as the dynamical drivers of sea surface temperature anomalies in the Coral Sea, and then how they are related to coral bleaching events that are found on these various islands in the Southwest Pacific. Okay, so the implementation in terms of observations, it's quite complex. We have focused really, I guess you might say there's three main regional focuses, and that is the Solomon Sea, where we have moorings, cruises and glider observations that I'll go into detail in the next few slides. Then there's a Coral Sea region where we've had enhanced Argo seeding and maintenance of a high-resolution XBT line that's been running for over 3 decades now, these high-resolution XBT lines. There's been gliders also across the East Australian current off of Brisbane, as well as down here in the Tasman Sea extension. So we've had a number of high-resolution hydrographic surveys of temperature, salinity, currents, and dissolved oxygen. And where possible, we've also included nutrients and geochemical data in collaboration with geotracers. The glider measurements, like I mentioned, we first used to demonstrate how technologically feasible they were. So we had them across the western boundary currents off Queensland and New South Wales, and also in the 2 coastal jets near Vanuatu and New Caledonia. We have moorings deployed off here in the East Australian current off of Brisbane, as well as up here in the Solomon Sea, and they are moorings consisting of direct measurements of temperature, salinity and velocity, as well as pies moorings that measure travel time and provide integrals of mass transport at higher resolution. We have also enhanced Argo seeding in the SPICE area, as well as surface drifters and XBT measurements in this region since SPICE was initiated. Okay, so to date, some of the more significant science results that have come out of SPICE, these have mainly covered in often an overview paper led by Alex in this 2014 special edition of JGR that we had, and there's also numerous other papers in that special edition that cover these individual accomplishments. For instance, we have determined, have a much more detailed description of the oceanic pathways to the equator, including these jets and the western boundary currents, as well as the water origins of the equatorial undercurrent, which is an overarching goal of SPICE. There was a discovery of the deep extension of the New Caledonia jet, as well as the Papua current, and that versus what we now know is a very broad and shallow North Vanuatu jet. So these jets that are formed when the SEC hits the islands are very different in characteristics and also in their depth, extent, and strength. As I'll discuss more, we've got a much better description of the flows and circulation in the Solomon Sea, in the inflows and outflows in their partition, and this particularly has been a result of the modelling effort with these 136-degree models that have been developed as part of SPICE. There's been this strong interplay between the Tasman front and the East Australian current, which has opposite variations on decadal timescales versus interannual timescales. And there's been an improved understanding of the tilt associated with the South Pacific Convergence Zone and its relationship with local SST wind and rainfall. Okay, so as I said, I'm really going to focus the rest of this talk primarily on the SPICE effort in the Solomon Sea, and that's totally from a selfish reason, because that's a main part that I'm involved with, and so that's a part that I am primarily familiar with. But I also think it's where most of the US involvement is. These projects that I'll talk about have been primarily funded through NSF, my own work in the hydrographic surveys and the mooring deployments is all NSF funded, whereas the glider surveys and the XVT network and the PIES moorings that I'll talk about have all been funded through OCO through NOAA funding. So in the Solomon Sea, we have this strong western boundary, lower latitude western boundary current that feeds through the Solomon Sea and exits into the equatorial undercurrent or into the Indonesian through flow. It's really an outstanding question as yet. But when it does pass through these three narrow exit ways, Video Strait here, St. George's Channel here, and the much wider Solomon Strait, it's carrying very different water masses to what it is from the inflow region. So we have these really high mixing is suspected to occur from the inflow passages to the outflow passages. And we can see that in this figure here of the TS diagram, temperature and salinity. And in blue, this is the temperature and salinity profiles from outside the Solomon Sea, from the inflow region. So you can see it's characterized by the salinity maximum of the South Pacific tropical water and a salinity minimum associated with the Antarctic intermediate water. And that's in blue at the inflow passages, and by the time it gets up here into pass through Video Strait in red or up towards the equator here in green, you can see that there's a strong erosion of both the salinity maximum and the salinity minimum found in the intermediate water. So that suggests that there is very strong water mass transformation occurring in the Solomon Sea, but we don't really understand yet on what timescales that might occur. It's also one of the least documented seas of the Southwest Pacific, and there were, before SPICE was initiated, there was very few prior observations. There was a few discrete surveys as part of the WEPOX experiment and a few hydrographic measurements, but during SPICE we really focused our efforts on the Solomon Sea. And furthermore, the models showed large discrepancies in the pathways of the flow. We know that there's probably this, the SEC breaks up into these different jets, and the North Vanuatu jet enters into the Solomon Sea. But many of the models showed that most of the flow went actually east of the Solomon Islands. And so it was disputable whether that is actually, well, we still don't know whether that is the case because we don't have many of the measurements here, but that they, nonetheless, the models show that there was not significant inflow going into the Solomon Sea. Okay, so some of the Solomon Sea programs included the hydrographic surveys. We had extensive hydrographic surveys in 2012 during the strong southeast monsoon trade season. And then in February 2015, we had a repeat survey known as More SPICE. That was something that was funded through NSF, which was carried out during the opposite phase of the monsoon season, during the northwest trades, which are much weaker than the southeast trades. And then finally, last year, we also had a French effort called Cassiope. During these two surveys, we deployed 3-year moorings deployments in the main outflow passages of Video Strait, St. George's Channel, and Solomon Strait. We had multiple mooring deployments in each strait, and because it is challenging conditions, I mean, these are really strong dynamic straits, very narrow mostly. These two straits are only 30 kilometres wide versus it's about 180 kilometres, and so we really get focused, strong currents coming through these passages, which is really a trial for the moorings. It was very tricky for these moorings to be maintained in these straits. At the same time as we put out the moorings as part of a French and US effort in Papua New Guinea, the Japanese also put out moorings up here in the New Island Current, which was just a fantastic addition for SPICE. This happened after we had the NSF grant funded and France had their part funded, and so this was really an interesting, fantastic addition for SPICE because it and they were moorings deployed at the same time as these moorings in these straits, so we can actually trace the water masses and current variability as the flow exits through Solomon Strait into the New Island Current. We also maintain high-resolution XBT lines through the Solomon Strait, and as I mentioned, there have been gliders across the in the Solomon Sea. That's a monthly time series since 2007, and supplemented by PIES moorings, which resolve mass and heat transports. So just to break it down into a couple of recent science results that stem from specifically from these two cruises. Pandora, as I said, was in August 2012. That was on the French vessel, La Adelante. We took 170 CTD, O2 and LADC casts around the Solomon Sea. But a key part of Pandora was also biogeochemical measurements. We had radium isotope measurements, methane, nitrogen fixation for the biology, and we had our trace elements. We had the special CTD, special Niskin bottles for the trace element detection. And we also deployed the moorings on this cruise. And then in February of 2014, we were on the RV Thompson. We undertook 78 CTD O2 LADCP casts. Many of these were repeat casts of what we undertook during Pandora. We did not have the extensive biogeochemistry component that we had during Pandora, but we did have a significant biology component. And we also recovered the moorings that we deployed during Pandora and redeployed a sparser array as part of an ongoing survey as part of that Cassiope project that I discussed. So in terms of science, these have primarily been led by various students as part of French and US collaboration. This is work that's been done by SIO student Marion Alberti, and she's been using the CTD and LADCP data and the Argo profiles from the region to look at mixing in the Solomon Sea using techniques such as sport scales as well as fine-scale parameterization based on shear and strain estimates. And so these are preliminary results from Marion. She's writing this up at the moment, but she's showing that there's elevated mixing occurring, elevated dissipation occurring. This is the mean dissipation rate above 500 meters. Elevated dissipation is associated with the straits and with bathymetry. And Cyril Germineau, who is a student at Lagos, is also been busy looking at that LADCP and the CTD casts from the two different hydrographic surveys to construct an inverse model of the circulation within the Solomon Sea. And he's specifically interested how these inflow and outflow patterns change between the strong trades that we had during the Pandora cruise versus the much weaker trades that we had in the February 2014 cruise. And then another student here at Scripps, when Anatalia, she has been using the PIES data that were deployed across the inflow passages of the Solomon Sea to look at a time series of absolute transport derived from these dynamic height and PIES moorings, as well as a mean dynamic topography derived from the altimetry data. And then she's compared it here with the glider transects, which has shown the discrete glider transport derived from the glider transects. And she's compared that here, her time series. So you can see that the PIES data enable her to really fill in the gaps between the glider transects. I mean, the glider transects potentially have it could potentially be aliased, right? Because they're taking a significant amount of time to, a month to cross between across the entranceway of the Solomon Sea. So it's potentially missing some of that high frequency variability, although the PIES time series shows that this significant variability is indeed real and is associated probably with intraseasonal variability. So finally, this is the PIES data. This is, as I said, they've now got 54 coast-to-coast sections across the Solomon Sea. It took them a while to determine the best pathway for the glider to follow, and now they've narrowed that down to going from this region of the Solomon Islands and then coming outside the western boundary current before going with the flow across the western boundary current. So that took a little bit of an effort to determine the best way for these gliders to survey the inflow transport in these really strong dynamic flows. But the time series that we now have, the 7-year time series, shows that the New Guinea coastal current, which is a very strong lower latitude western boundary current in this region, is strongly trapped to the topography and also has a very strong correlation with ENSO, such that there's enhanced equatorward transport during El Nino. Okay, so just to wrap up, what's next? We have continuing analysis as part of the thesis work for these students, including looking at the transport variability from the mooring time series. This is currently being quality controlled, so that's going to be an ongoing 1 to 2 year effort. We have a chapeau paper in progress, which is an overview paper to look at the overall hydrographic cruises as well as all of the biogeochemistry measurements and physical measurements, and Alex is leading that. Then we'll have a synthesis of all the concurrent time series from the different components as in the Solomon Sea, and then an ongoing modelling effort to improve the mixing parameterization and sub-mesoscale variability within the Solomon Sea. In terms of data management, all PIs have a password-protected data management site that allows data sharing within the SPICE researchers. There's links from our official website, spiceclivar.org, to all the freely available data collected as part of SPICE. That was enhanced Argo and HR high-resolution XBT deployments and drifter deployments. All the hydrographic data sets from the Solomon Sea that I discussed have been quality controlled and submitted to the NODC and the French data archives. Like I said, we're currently quality controlling the mooring data of temperature, salinity, and velocity. We'll be making that available through the Ocean Sites website in their net CDF format. And finally, an ultimate goal will be to make the data products, that is the transports, which are really the interesting quantity that modelers are interested in, and we'll be making those freely available to the community through the official website. So what worked? International collaboration was really key for us in organising the ship time. We used both French and US vessels. and it was instrumental for sharing instrument resources. I had many instruments that Alex and Sophie didn't have, so we were able to share our ADCPs, and conversely, they were able to share different instruments with us, as well as mooring technicians. And like I've shown, there's been shared supervision of students. That's been really important. And in fact, we've had quite a few student personnel exchanges between France and the US. Marion was there as part of a Chateaubriand fellowship last year. I had a 3-month sabbatical there at the end of last year, and Cyril, who is a student with Alex, he spent a couple of months with me here at Scripps. We have frequent face-to-face meetings at international conferences, and we had a very successful capacity building workshop at UPNG in 2013, after Pandora, but prior to the mooring recovery, and that meant that there was strong participation by regional partners. So we were able to have many students from Papua New Guinea, from Fiji and Mimea participate in the cruises, and they will also use the data as part of their thesis work. So remaining challenges are the models. You really need this high resolution to fully resolve the sub-mesoscale phenomena, but then there's this computational burden, right, to running at basin scale over multi-decades. We have it's really convoluted topography, so there's still a lot of missing topography, which is a challenge for the models. And then there's also missing subgrid scale parameterization in terms of mixing and tidal effects missing in the models. Observations still needed. Well, Marion's work from the indirect estimates and mixings, but it would be really nice to have direct mixing estimates from microstructure surveys. We need long time series to resolve interannual to decadal changes. And we really tried hard to entrain atmospheric scientists as part of the overall SPICE project, but I feel like that was probably one of our downfalls. And I think that there's still a lot of issues to do with the South Pacific Convergence Zone variability, which is indeed still poorly represented in colloquial climate models. So there's still many open science questions. We still don't know, is there a western boundary current east of the Solomons? How is the flow partitioned through the straits, and what drives this? And what mechanisms might be responsible for mixing of the water masses along the different water pathways, and how much of that is ultimately transferred to the equatorial undercurrent. Okay, so in terms of then sustained measurements, we have coordinated now with our colleagues in the North Pacific, it's the NPOST study, who are studying the lower latitude western boundary currents in the North Pacific, as well as various projects in the Indonesian through-flow region, as well as SPICE. And we're hoping to put forward suggested surveying arrays for, it's a very complicated region, and so one particular component of the observing system is not going to get at all the questions that, or make successful measurements of the western boundary, these energetic western boundary currents. So we need to come up with an array of assets to be able to successfully measure or successfully provide sustained measurements. And we're doing that through the Western Pacific Task Team, which has members from both CLIVAR and TPOS 2020, and that's an effort that's underway at the present. Okay, so I'll wrap up now, and that's our website, spiceclivar.org, and you can find out more about participants, data, and references. Thank you.
Recording signal.